Chapter 63. Coda strode upon his grey riding wolf through the forest. The elves of Long Whisper had long used these giant wolves as a mode of transportation as opposed to the common riding horses used by most other countries. They were only slightly smaller than a horse, and easily carried the light weight of the elves. Athar Moonfall and Cass Baneberry rode on either side of him, both matching his slow pace. His familiar, Wild Eye, trotted just ahead of the three as they followed the long trail of their armies on the merchant road. The morning light failed to cut through the thick canopy, transforming an otherwise serene morning into a dim one.
I heard your arrow did a piss job of clearing out this forest. I also heard that one of the scoundrels died in a quarrel. Are you sure it's safe to take this route, my king? Asked Athar, as his head darted about suspiciously.
Cass answered back.
That scoundrel, as you put it, died so that our men could pass through this forsaken forest with little to no strife. Luckily for you, it was he that took the vile arrow and not you. It'd be a shame to fill your fine cloak with poisoned arrows. What a waste of good cloth.
Every word he spoke was coded in disdain. Athar sneered without making eye contact with the Lord.
We are fools to trust Arrow. They were trained by the King Killer himself.
That may be the case, but if King Coda trusts them, I would be willing to trust them myself,
Cass said without hesitation.
Once a black rabbit, always a black rabbit,
Athar responded snidely.
It takes a rabbit to hunt a rabbit, my lord,
finished Cass. The three of them turned to see Avalon galloping up from the rear on her own wolf. She caught up to their pace before pulling her reins to slow the wolf's speed. She made an extra effort to lean to control her mount as she remembered her utter failings as a drake rider.
The mountains rise in the distance. We are close to Stonewall. Has the scout returned to report his findings?
Avalon pointed to the tall mountains seen from a clearing in the tree.
We have no word from our scout, nor the one we sent before him, Coda said. When the first scout did not return, he felt a justified concern, but Athar convinced him that the forest was large and it would be easy for one to get lost. The realization set in, and Avalon became distressed.
My king, we are walking into a trap.
Nonsense, Silent One. Stonewall has no clue we are even coming.
Surely you jest, Avalon replied in disbelief. Stonewall has known of our arrival since we reached the shores. Why did you think Arrow ran into rabbits 2 days ago? If you do not halt our men, I will do it for you, spat Avalon.
Athar's face grew sour.
Do you forget yourself, Silent One? I should have you in chains for such insolence.
Avalon turned to Coda with desperation on her face. My king, listen to reason. What waits beyond this forest is death. We need to send Ellicard to investigate what Stonewall has in store for us.
Coda turned to Athar and then to Cass, as if looking for an answer to a question he did not know.
My king, if we send Ellicard to investigate, who is to say he won't join his former Black Rabbit companions? If I am to remember correctly, Captain Newson did mention that Ellicard chased after and killed a potential prisoner during their mission. Ellicard is no soldier of Long Whisper. He cannot and should not ever be trusted,
Athar stated earnestly. A large crash and the splintering of trees filled the air from up ahead, interrupting their conversation. Blood-curdling screams rang out as wooden shrapnel lodged itself in the flesh of dozens of men. Several more loud sounds came crashing in from the distance, as if a giant were barreling through the trees, shaking the forest by the roots. Panic ran rampant throughout the caravan.
Athar Moonfall, you've doomed us all, spat Avalon, as a scowl grew on her face.
Athar hid a cruel smile. He knew what he had done. He had played Coda to look like an inexperienced fool, but his work was not yet complete. Coda swallowed hard. His face was a ghostly white. A voice in his head told him to take a deep breath and remain calm. He did as the voice said. He collected himself so that he could lead his army.
Cass, Athar, Avalon, on me,
he ordered as he kicked his heels into the wolf's side and rose past countless soldiers making his way to the front lines. The leading point of the army was a complete disaster. Fallen trees had collapsed on top of unlucky soldiers. Blood was splattered across the dirt. Limbs were scattered about as mangled men crawled for cover. Far in the distance, the city of Stonewall was nestled in a valley of the mountains. A vanguard of Estinian soldiers and siege weaponry were set up beyond the edge of the forest. Ballistas recoiled and fired gruesome, flaming steel-tipped bolts into the forest as they collided into the frantic men below. The trees exploded from the impact of bolts, cracking the trunks into deadly wooden shrapnel. Catapults launched large flaming boulders into the canopy, crashing down with sundering force, decimating soldiers below. "Fall back! Fall back!" The commands of General Ashmore could be heard cutting through the chaos like an axe. Coda took another look at the destructive enemy force outside Stonewall before running back deeper into the forest, leaving the apocalyptic scene of his inexperience and failure behind. Chapter 64. Deep within the night, the light sounds of scurrying could be heard as Essie moved across the forest floor. She used her arrow training to muffle her footsteps and used the color of her cloak to mask her cold breath in the frigid darkness. In the distance beyond the forest's edge, the camps of the Estinian forces could be seen. Large fires blazed as groups of enemy soldiers huddled around the welcoming warmth. Coda's men had no such opportunity to light even an ember. A single spark would give away their position, and another onslaught of attacks would befall the already shaken forest. The first week, the king's mages were able to shield the soldiers from most attacks. However, after a while, their magic waned and several of the mages were killed. That left the remaining 6 mages hesitant to be so bold. Essie leaned against an uprooted tree. Its trunk was large enough to provide a temporary cover as she took a moment to count her supplies. She bit her lip when she found herself low on dullweed, a plant used to numb the pain of a patient. She tried to think how her supply could have run out so quickly. They had been entrenched in this forest for the last week. She started with at least 20 pieces of the weed, and that was enough for 40 patients. The attacks left soldiers completely mutilated and maimed. Dullweed was given out liberally at first, but all that changed after the 3rd night. "I shall find some bitter bark." Bitter bark was not as potent as dullweed, but kept the pain low enough to avoid sending a patient in shock. Finding it would be the tricky part. But at this point, it would not be as scarce as dullweed. Noticing a flash of shadows weave into an adjacent tree, she whistled a low call to grab the attention of the fellow soldier. The soldier poked his head around the corner, showing that he was a fellow medic. Essie motioned for him to run to her, but the medic seemed too fearful to expose himself. After another failed attempt at convincing him to come over, Essie darted and slid to his tree. "Private Essie Winfoot, 1st Anti-Rogops." Essie rapped out her name, rank, and unit in a single heavy breath, sure to keep her tone low so that he could hear, but not those around her. "Corporal Jepson Revertread, 2nd Medical Corps. I'm attached to the 1st Wolf Lancer Division. Can't find any of them, though. Have you seen any Wolf Lancers, Private?" His eyes were tired and blank. The unit he was attached to was part of the front line. The Wolf Lancers were scattered after the first day, and Jepson had been wandering among the forest ever since. Essie instinctively checked Jepson for any visible wounds. He was shaken to the core, but he was not physically injured. She frowned and shook her head. "Sorry, Corporal. I've not run into your kin." She pointed a ways off, waiting for some time for Jepson to be signaled by her motions. "I know if you walk a bit that way, you'll run into Sergeant Elimder Barwick. He's a platoon sergeant from the 2nd Tactical Information Relay Division. If Tyr doesn't know where the Wolf Lancers are, well, he'll know." Jepson continued to stare off in a daze. After a minute or two, he finally responded. "Thanks, Winfoot." Essie grabbed him by the sleeve as he was getting up. "Corporal, do you have any dullweed you can spare? Maybe some bitter bark?" Jepson reached into his haversack and pulled out a sack of dullweed tied by twine and tossed it into Essie's shivering hands. She smiled weakly and carefully stashed the dullweed in her medical satchel. She watched as Jepson trudged slowly in the forest once more. She took a long breath and moved out of her resting place herself. The night grew colder as the pale moonlight revealed itself from the navy blue clouds. The night was at the principle of danger when the moon came out. What once was a safe and quiet time within the foxholes became a troublesome rat race to keep from being hit by bombarding boulders and piercing ballista bolts. Essie dashed quickly, sliding into the nearest foxhole as the delicate moonlight dawned on the forest floor. The frosty air hung silent. Not a howl from a wolf, nor a peep from a soldier could be heard throughout the lines. Blavar and Lear smiled lightly, happy to see the familiar face of Essie as she dove into their foxhole. They wrapped their cloaks around themselves to keep warm. Lear nibbled on the carcass of a vole he found in the loose dirt. He tried sharing the mutilated rodent with Essie, but she made a squirming face and politely refused the offer. Blavar prodded Essie on the arm and used his arrow training to whisper lowly,
Hey, Az, any word on when more rations are coming this way? We haven't eaten.
He scrunched his face at the sight of Lear happily chewing the small critter's bones and intestines.
I haven't eaten in 3 days.
Essie took out her last loaf of bread and broke off a sizable piece. She tore that piece in half and gave the pieces to Blavar and Lear.
Chew slowly. When you eat too fast, after having not eaten for so long, you can get awful stomach cramps,
Essie warned as she inspected her two companions for any physical damage.
Which way to the captain's foxhole?
She finally asked after being satisfied with her inspections.
This Yagati saw him taking a piece further to the east. Be careful, Essie,
Lear said between a mouthful of bread. Essie nodded as she jumped out of the hole and sprinted to the east. Essie crawled on the flat of her stomach as she moved closer to Wicker and Ashmer's foxhole. Once already, a fiery boulder had careened through the night, crashing somewhere in the northern lines. Cries from medics broke through the thin air, giving away the fact that Estina had landed another triumphant strike. Essie squeezed her eyes shut, drowning out the screams of anguish, attempting to concentrate on the task at hand. She needed to find out if there was any more supplies coming from the north to refill her dwindling resources, rations, and a possible resupply of fresh men.
Captain,
Essie whispered at the edge of the foxhole. She was surprised to find that the foxhole was filled with several people. Along with Wicker and Ashmer, Avalon and Ellicard were in the foxhole as well. Wicker reached over and gingerly pulled Essie into the warmth that the several bodies gave off. They were huddled in a circle, looking over a topographical map of Stonewall and the surrounding forests and mountains. Several X's were scratched onto the map, each indicating the location of the different units and overall forces of Coda's men. A set of lines and circles marked up the Stonewall side of the map, indicating Estina's large force.
I've reported to King Coda, Lord Ather, and Lady Baneberry that we've lost a quarter of our men to wounds, injuries, and sickness. Another quarter is also in rough shape and will probably add to our casualties if we stay in this position another week,
spoke Ashmer in a low, raspy voice. He coughed and hacked as he attempted to get the string of words in one go. Essie took out her water skin and a few herbs. She placed the herbs into a wooden noggin and poured the contents of her water skin into the small cup.
It is not hot tea, General, but this will help you with your cough.
Ashmer gratefully accepted. His face puckered from the bitter taste.
Could use some sugar, Private.
Essie frowned lightheartedly.
Fresh out of sugar, sir.
Fresh out of a lot of things, added Avalon grimly.
When are we getting fresh supplies, Captain?
Essie asked Wicker.
We were supposed to get new supplies 2 days ago. We've heard nothing from the quartermaster. No Raven, no Scout, nothing.
His mind was heavy with the entire situation, not just the lack of information coming from the northern shore.
Ellicard, what are your thoughts? Are the Black Rabbits cutting off our supply caravans?
Asked Ashmer between wheezes. Ellicard looked at Avalon as she nodded the answer that he already knew.
No doubt, General.
Ashmer's mood soured even more. He took the final sip of the cold brewed tea before turning his attention to Wicker.
I don't know how many rabbits are on the road to the north. Obviously enough to interrupt a large supply caravan. Can your arrow recapture that access road?
Wicker's eyes darted to Essie, then to Ellicard before finally giving his gloomy answer.
General, my men haven't had rations in the last 3 days. They are stricken with sickness and have not slept in a week. To ask them to deal with a squad of Black Rabbits would be unwise. I would advise taking a platoon of men to secure the road.
Ashmer frowned from the answer.
I will advise Coda and the two lords to make a decision. As of now, we have no food, no medical supplies, sick men, and nowhere to bring our injured. If we do not take swift action, the king's best option will be to surrender and hope that Estina takes prisoners.
Essie scrambled up the foxhole. Supplies or not, defeat or not, her job was not done. She pressed onward into the cold, somber night. Chapter 65.
We have King Coda just where we want him, cowering in the forest with his men dying all around him, said Commander Unrik, smiling with bloodthirsty satisfaction. He was the leader of the Estinian occupying force of Stonewall. He was a weaselly man with a long nose, a thin minute-hand mustache, and a bony chin that matched his cheeks. At the top of his chin, he sported a neatly tinned tuft.
Unrik gazed out of the circular window as his siege machinery continued their horrific onslaught on the forest. Turning around, he sat back down at the desk within the room that once had been the office of Stonewall's former mayor. He spent a solid minute wiping his teeth clean of any remnants of pheasant meat before turning his attention to the two men that waited patiently to be addressed. Inlay, what news of the northern shore do you bring me? He finally asked. Inlay bowed graciously, as he had learned quickly to do in the presence of his volatile allies. They were easy to upset and quick to be offended. My lord, my High Blade has sent a large squad of our kin to capture the roads. Please allow him to make the report. Unrik nodded toward Legion, indicating for him to pick up where Inlay had left off. My men have captured and burned several supply caravans headed to Kota's front lines. We also shot down several messenger ravens, both requesting more supplies and warning the front lines of the road being captured. We have effectively stopped all flow of support to Kota. Legion reported. His voice was monotone and without emotion. It was unsettling to Inlay. This is good news to hear. The Divar will be pleased with my performance, Unrik said, sitting back and smiling. As you can see, my lord, we black rabbits are an excellent Inlay started. The Divar would indeed be happy with you rabbits, if you could perform one more task. Inlay looked at Legion before responding to Unrik. And what task would that be, my lord? Kota needs to die tonight. Can you do that, rabbit? Of course, that can be arranged, my lord, said Inlay as he bowed pompously. Outside the office, Legion glided gracefully but aggressively to Inlay. Grabbing him by the collar, he slammed him against the wall. Do not let this power trip go to your head, First Blade. I am High Blade. I am in command of this operation. I accept the missions. I deal with everything while the Silent Master is not at hand. Legion was fierce and a legend in his own right. One to be revered. Inlay knew this, but he also knew Legion was in no position to make threats. The Divra saw Inlay as the commander of the Black Rabbits, and so long as they were to continue this campaign, Inlay would be sure to play that part. He was a performer, after all, and he saw him fitting this part perfectly. But he would have to handle Legion delicately all the same. Without Legion on his side, the rest of the rabbits would not give him his due respect. My High Blade, I would never overstep my boundaries. I am simply the liaison for our clan to the Estinian people. Nothing more, nothing less. Do not play coy with me, Inlay. I am fully aware the kind of elf you are capable of being, snapped Legion, tightening his grip. Let us not forget who is partially responsible for crafting me into that elf. Legion narrowed his eyes and released him. Take Dest and Vemrick with you. Kota is but a mouse in a corner. I will go alone. A cornered mouse will bite. Take them. The collective experience will be good for the mission. The moon was cloaked in a veil of clouds, as it had been for the last several nights. The lack of moonlight made for an excellent cover as the Black Rabbit slipped through the front lines of Kota's forces. The trio moved around several foxholes, searching each one for Kota's. Look at how they slumber, Inlay. It would be a shame not to kill each one, Dest mused as she loomed over a nest of soldiers sleeping in a huddled clump within the foxhole. Inlay took a brief moment to watch a soldier stir innocently before going back to searching for Kota's foxhole. We have work to do, Dest. Don't get distracted. Dest unsheathed her blade silently and chuckled. Well, what about you, Vemrick? Want to slit a few throats while we're here? Dest's smile disappeared as Vemrick's response did not reach her ears. Vemrick? Dest turned to find her companion missing. She swiftly scanned her surroundings, calling for Vemrick as loud and as far as her whispers could reach, but still no answer back from the elf. Inlay took in a long sigh, clearly annoyed with the performance of the supposedly experienced Dest and Vemrick. Will you two quit fooling around? He, too, was met with silence. Twice the silence as before. Quickly, he spun around, blade at the ready. To his curious delight, he found 3 oddly dressed assassins. They looked like Black Rabbits, but instead of the traditional black and violet colors, they bore crimson, red, and black uniforms. Inlay's curiosity got the best of him. His perplexed face grew a wide smile once he saw the bodies of Dest and Vemrick laying at the feet of the 3 strangers.
Assassins from Varus? Inlay asked, tapping his sword on his shoulder in a casual manner. One of the assassins removed her hood to show off her exotically beautiful shadow elven face. She twirled a dagger around in her fingers. It's been a long time, Shadowkin. Inlay's pleasure was slowly turning into quivering rage at the sight of Elisa. I see you are running with a new clan? Lear removed his hood, revealing his keen Yakati eyes. We be no assassins, rabbit. Blavar lowered his mask and took a pair of daggers from a set of sheaths behind his waist. We're watchers, born and bred to hunt assassins. Now watch us work. Inlay was furious.
Elisa trained Koda's men in the Black Rabbit ways to hunt black rabbits?
He did his best to mask his anger and simply bowed. A new show was about to start. His audience had taken their seats, and it was now time to be the showstopper he was born to be. Blavar, Lear, and Elisa rushed him, enclosing on all sides. Lear's reach was longer, forcing Inlay to deal with the Yakati's rapier first. Inlay spun into the inside reach of Lear and struck the cat's chest with an elbow, knocking Lear backwards. Blavar sliced furiously with his set of knives, but Inlay leapt and flipped over Lear, gathering distance away from the arrow members. Elisa cartwheeled with a single hand to match the speed of Inlay's movements. Finishing off with a graceful roundhouse kick at Inlay's head, Inlay snapped his forearm up and blocked the kick, dropping his own body down and sweeping his leg into Elisa's legs, tripping her backward. Inlay took advantage of his off-balance opponent and thrust a side kick into her ribs. The blow sent her flying into a nearby tree. Inlay spun his sword in his hand as he neared Elisa's crumpled body, but was caught by a dagger driving into his side. Furious at the sneak attack made by Blavar, Inlay viciously backhanded the former thief. Blavar was knocked into the air, twisting like a rag doll and slamming into the cold ground. Inlay raised his blade to strike down and finish Blavar, but Lear slid into sight, parrying Inlay's blade to the side. Inlay huffed in annoyance, attempting to reach for his weapon, but Lear slapped it further away. Before Arrow, this Yakati was an accomplished swordsman. Perhaps better than you, rabbit. Inlay feigned to reach for his blade again, but pulled out and threw several daggers into Lear's throat and right shoulder. Lear reached for his wounds in shock, giving Inlay ample time to grab his blade and thrust it into Lear's stomach. Inlay finished his advance by kicking the Yakati off of his blade. Inlay grabbed Blavar by the tuft of his hair and brought the elf's head close to him. Where is Koda? Find him yourself, hissed Blavar. Inlay glanced about his surroundings. No doubt the commotion from the fight would bring others to investigate. He was wasting time dealing with this nuisance. With a hefty backhand, he rendered Blavar unconscious. Very well, he whispered as he left to look for Koda's foxhole. The back of the forest was quieter than the front lines. Although the cold night enhanced how sound traveled through the forest, the back lines were relatively undisturbed by Inlay's skirmish with the Watchers. The shadow elf crouched over the foxhole of Koda and his two tribal lords. Koda stirred in his sleep, as Kath and Athar slumbered in the much-needed peace that the unattacked forest provided. Taking out a thin choking wire, Inlay carefully wrapped it around the throat of the Mage King, rising the two ends ever so slightly so that the wire tightened at a slow pace. At first there was not much movement from Inlay's victim, but soon Koda's feet fidgeted as he began to choke and struggle. Drop him, Inlay. A burning memory shot through Inlay's ears and drove deep into his mind like a meteor crashing through the atmosphere. That voice, a voice he could never forget. That voice was carved into his heart, mind, and soul. But it could not be him. Inlay hesitated, haunted by the familiar voice. He turned around to face where it came from, nearly gagging on a flood of emotions. Master, is that you? Whispered Inlay. He raised his mask from his face to get a better look. He struggled to quell an enormous amount of questions and revived hopes and dreams. Ellicard's cold, dead stare would have slain any common man. But Inlay was no common man. Ellicard signaled for the remainder of his arrow team to surround the smitten Inlay. The wire in the rabbit's hand slacked, and Koda lurched forward, gasping for air. Inlay's hands shivered as he tried to quell the clutter of feelings. Anger, longing, confusion, and love coursed through his heart and mind. Master, you are alive. How can this be?
Inlay sputtered. Ellicard attempted to step closer, but Inlay snapped out of his stupor and snatched Coda by his collar and brought him into his arms. A sharp dagger rested under Coda's chin, pressing hard against the king's throat. "I've seen your tricks, my king. Make a move and I'll bleed you dry right here," Inlay threatened. The young elf had always had a firm grasp on his actions and emotions, but now he was a mess. His thoughts were erratic, and this night had been a brewing storm of unpredictability and failure. How could Ellicard be alive? Why did he wait until now to reveal himself? Inlay lowered his mask. "Inlay, drop him. There is no winning this battle," said Ellicard, ignoring Inlay's question and trying to reason with his former student. "Master, you will be proud to know I am the first blade now. I have sway in the clan. Come back with me, and you can rejoin us. All can be forgiven, master. We can be a family once more," said Inlay as he slowly backed away with his hostage. "Let him pass," Wicker exclaimed. "Timber, keep an eye on him." Ellicard gingerly kept up with Inlay as the shadow elf retreated toward the Estinian lines. Inlay recanted tales of a happier time for him. "You and I were an unstoppable team. Can you imagine what we could do together now? You could even be First Blade again. I wouldn't mind. I'd do anything for you, Ellicard." Ellicard knew the situation was delicate. His student was as delusional as ever, but now he had Coda's life at knife point. "Inlay, I don't want you to die this night. Not by their hands. You and I could be together, but not if my team kills you. You need to let the king go and come with me." Ellicard spoke as calmly as possible. Thoughts raced through his head as he tried to diffuse the situation as best he could, with whatever words he thought would appease the delusional Inlay. Inlay breached the clearing before the Estinian siege line. He pressed the dagger's edge into the flesh of Coda's neck until he drew blood. "Is this true? You and I are no longer enemies?" a hopeful Inlay asked his master. "Inlay, I only wish I could forgive you," Ellicard said. "Even in death, Jeddah twists your soul." Seeing that Ellicard and Inlay were now distracted with the baggage of their past, Kalsoon slid a dagger down his arm into his palm. With a flick of the wrist, the knife whistled through the air and impacted Inlay's steel mask with a loud thud. Inlay's head reeled back as he stumbled away backward. Ellicard dashed forward and pulled Coda to safety. Wicker made a quick glance at Timber. "Now!" he shouted. Timber let loose an arrow straight for Inlay's chest, but Inlay was fractions quicker, grabbing the arrow just as it penetrated his leather armor. He danced lightly into the shadows, making a graceful bow, as if the theater curtains had drawn to a close. Kalsoon indulged the clown with a long, exaggerated bow of his own. "Until next time, friend," he whispered under his breath. Inlay walked the streets of Stonewall. Thoughts swirled in his head like a tropical storm. Too distracted to even see where he was going, he passed Legion leaning against the side of the local tavern. "You failed your mission. Your Estinian friends won't be happy about this." Legion sneered, almost smugly. Inlay held his mask in one hand. The other held his heavy face. He was in no condition to be the first blade tonight. In the past, he had come to terms with the fact that the love of his life was dead, but now that reality had been crushed into a fine powder. "What's more, you let Dest and Vemrick fall under your watch. They were useful veterans of our clan. I will not forgive this failure, nor will the Silent Master." Legion's callous words continued. Inlay slowly rose his gaze to meet his high blade. His eyes were sunken and watery from tears. His mental state was a shambled mess. "What do you have to say for yourself, Inlay?" Legion finished. "He's alive." Inlay choked out a short whisper. "Who?" Legion asked. "Ellicard." Chapter 66. Coda knelt at the side of the injured Lear, holding his hand tightly as Essie did her best to tend to his bloody wound. A bandage was wrapped around the bruising on his neck. It throbbed, but it let him know he was alive. Alive, thanks to Ellicard's efforts. The man that slain his father and left him alive as an act of mercy had now saved his life. He was at Alana's feet. Even a single second of hesitation and he would have been dead. Lear winced as Essie cleaned the wound with a bottle of whiskey that she scavenged from the neighboring 8th Spearman. Her dwindling medical supplies did not deter her from working at her utmost peak with what she had.
Is he going to be all right?
Koda asked, his eyes wide with hope and worry. The Yakati was a hero to him. All of Aero proved to be more than he expected. The amount of dirt they had to endure from himself and his military had all been unwarranted.
Well, I'm using the last of my dollweed on Lear here. I have to clean his wounds with this half-empty bottle of whiskey. I don't have any blister cloth to close his wound. On the bright side, the rabbit's blade missed any vital organs, and I think the bleeding will stop once I get him stitched up. So long as he doesn't fight any more rabbits and break his stitches, he should be fine. Of course, if he does break them, he'll bleed to death because I don't have the supplies to save him. But we'll cross that bridge when we get there.
Essie said, her tone rife with dark humor and sarcasm. Koda did not find the dire situation as humorous. However, Essie was pleased that her catfolk friend merely chuckled.
Bring words of any changes to Lear's condition, positive or negative,
commanded Koda as he stood and brushed the soil from his trousers. He moved quickly, making his way back to the northern lines. Cass moved quietly through the black lines, checking on the weary and sleepless men, reassuring them that the end of the nights in the forest of the splintered skies was at its end. Men with blood-stained bandages swathed around their faces and arms in slings were happy to see their lady. They swore an oath to serve their tribe and would not falter. However, this forest was known to make weak even the strongest men. No common elves such as these were safe from the demoralizing effect of another 2 weeks of dire straits. Koda's army had been held at Estina's mercy for nearly a month now. They had no supplies, they had no access to fresh men, and they had no way to retreat. They had only themselves and the hope that their leaders gave them. Cass slid into the foxhole that her king and fellow lord were in. Cass knew her situation was grim, but she kept her misery low. Athar, on the other hand, let his misery shine.
My king, this is the 23rd sunrise that we've endured in this forest. We have run out of fresh water, and when we sent men to find a river, only half of them returned. No doubt black rabbits were the culprits. We have run out of food. The same fate that befell the water scouts have struck the foragers as well. Rabbits, no doubt, my king.
Koda stared bitterly at Athar. He had given his report every day since they arrived in this mess. Koda ignored Athar, but he continued.
My king, our medics say that over half our army is either injured or have fallen ill. My king, we cannot wait to die any longer. Action must be taken.
Koda slowly turned his head away from Athar. Indeed, something needed to be done. A full-on assault was never advised by Ashmer. At their best, his army would have been decimated by the siege engines.
My king, an Estinian officer requests a parley to speak with you,
called out a voice, breaking Koda's depressing thoughts. Koda looked up to see a messenger staring back down at him. His young, dirt-covered face bore witness to the fact that he had seen too much for one lifetime. However, there was still vigor in his eyes. He was still ready to fight for the freedom of Varus and Long Whisper. Athar, come with me. Cass, fetch Wicker, Avalon, and Ashmer, and then come join us on the front lines. We shall see what Estina has in store for us. On the field between the Estinian lines and the forest border, Koda and his company stood facing Estinian soldiers on white horses. They were not in any sort of armor, but in clean and pressed tan military tunics adorned with various medals and ribbons. By their sides were sheathed ornate golden sabers. King Koda, it is a pleasure to finally meet you. I am Commander Unrik. I command this great army of Estinian soldiers. As you can see, we have come to wish you to be no more in harm's way. Koda bowed politely. Commander, what do you have to say? King Koda, we are prepared to march into the forest and slaughter every one of your men to capture and enslave you. However, that is not necessary. We have the resources. Do not forget that. We are allowing you to surrender your men and your crown. You will be taken in either as slaves or are to continue their service, but in their service of the one true king, the Divra. Surrender, said Koda, taken aback. He saw this ultimatum coming from leagues away, but to have it stated to him so plainly caught him slightly off guard. It was all too real. We will give you until dawn to think it over. Good day, King Koda, finished Unrik before nodding and trotting back to Stonewall.
You must surrender, my king,
Athar urged. Coda, Avalon, Wicker, Ashmer, Athar, and Cass stood in a secluded but well-guarded section of the woods. Athar's negativity must have finally wore through Coda's mind, because it seemed like the best option. Ashmer, can anything else be done? Coda asked his general, desperation throttling his voice. My king, our men are prepared to fight, Ashmer exclaimed, but was cut short by Athar. You mean prepared to die? Avalon shoved herself in front of Athar to pull Coda's attention to her. My king, we can no longer pretend that a soldier or king's way will solve this dire situation. What do you suggest, Avalon? Asked Wicker, although he had a keen guess as to what the Silent One was alluding to. We must think like a black rabbit, Avalon said, cracking a thin smile. Hear me out. I was trained as a rabbit before I became a Silent One. I cannot help but still think like one. Your soldiers and noblemen are a bleak situation. As a black rabbit, I see an obvious action to be taken by you, my king. You wish to assassinate Unrik? Asked Coda, already irked by the thought. Take him prisoner. He commands the Estinians, cut off the head of the dragon, and it can no longer breathe fire. With Unrik in our possession, he will command his army to surrender and open Stonewall's gates. Everyone around Avalon nodded to the plan. Who do you suggest sending? Wicker asked. Myself, Ellicard, Calsoon, and your sniper, Timber, she said, counting on her hand. She then pointed to Wicker. You and the rest of Arrow protect Coda. He could still be in danger. I don't trust this inlay. Wicker nodded and turned to Coda. My king, do you approve of this mission? I do. May the gods grant you strength in your hearts and sanctuary in your souls. Chapter 67. Slipping through the siege lines as silently as the clouds passed through the sky, Ellicard, Avalon, Timber, and Calsoon made their way to the walls of the mountain pass city. The walls reached high and were not smooth. Stones jutted out and were riddled with various cracks, allowing them to serve as fine footholds. The shadowy team crouched in the darkness of the walls, waiting for a pair of night patrolmen to pass. Ellicard had his team inch closer to the wall to avoid the rim of the illuminating torchlight. Once the two patrolmen had passed by completely, Ellicard nodded to Timber. Timber moved to an appropriate angle from the wall and a watchtower on top of the battlements and, with excellent accuracy, shot a guard above. The arrow was well placed and quick to kill, piercing the throat. Beyond the reach of the ever-watchful eyes of the enemy, the infiltrators made their way up and passed their first obstacle. Upon making it to the battlements, the squad leapt agilely from rooftop to rooftop. Timber held the rear, spotting and taking out several rooftop archers guarding the city sky. This seems too easy, Ellicard, Timber whispered as she sniped a third archer. Or are we just that good? Little bit of both, I suppose, smirked Ellicard, although a bit on edge. Rabbit, Avalon hissed as she spied an assassin fleeing a neighboring building. I'm on it, Timber called out in a low voice. However, her arrow did not fly true. It skimmed off the rabbit's right shoulder as he dropped out of sight behind an adjacent building. Calsoon, take him out. We'll continue forth, Ellicard ordered. Calsoon swiftly leaped and flipped after the enemy. He soared through an open window and hurtled through the upper room, landing next to the now surprised assassin. The assassin did not pause for introduction and dashed out of the building with breakneck speed, knocking over crates and hopping over wooden fences. Calsoon followed closely by, making his way through the makeshift obstacle course. The chase made its way throughout the wide array of alleys and across the cobblestone streets. They raced, passing over hay carts, under parked horses, and around wagons. Finally, Calsoon stopped dead in his tracks as the rabbit crashed into the doors of a large temple. Just inside the archway, the assassin could be seen. His labored breathing echoed off the walls. He stumbled backwards on his backside, further into the church as he watched the motionless Calsoon. Calsoon smiled a wicked grin. His toes barely grazed the borders of the temple's doors. Sala esh ruala vedako. No angel's embrace will save you from my reach. Calsoon hissed in a bizarre ancient tongue, a tongue that no elf nor any priest of that temple had ever heard. Calsoon's eyes drained into a dark amber. He beckoned to the now frightened assassin. Come, friend. You and I are kindred spirits. We both worship the same god. We both want to walk out of this night alive. In another lifetime, we could have been friends. The rabbit shivered uncontrollably as he walked toward Kalsoon.
I don't want to die. Promise me I won't die. Hush now, my friend. Allow me to sing you a soothing song, a song that will put your mind at ease in such a troublesome time as this. May the angels sing to you, my dear child. May they bring comfort to the king and the exiled. Let them come forth when you are helpless and scared. Let them give heart to the cowards and the unprepared. Until sunset, angels will fight until they must sleep.
The assassin now stood before Kalsoon, swaying in the cool night breeze. He was calm, locked in Kalsoon's hypnotic gaze. Tears rolled down his cheeks. Somewhere deep inside, he knew he was in the deadly grasp of an adder. With a flash of steel and a cold slice, the assassin's head bounced onto the ground.
Until sunrise, in the darkness I shall reap,
Kalsoon whispered, finishing the song. His eyes returned to a cold blue once more as he wiped his sword clean from the rabbit's blood. Kalsoon looked up at the stained glass window that embellished the archway above the entrance's keystone. It was decorated with the Allfather. His eyes seemed to look saddened. Kalsoon bowed to the decorative piece. Well, not everyone can be saved, my friend. A trail of blood made its way through the city hall's courtyard and up its steps. Soldiers' bodies lay crumpled on the ground, throats neatly slit. Through the lobby, guards leaned against the walls, daggers and arrows pinning them so they would not fall over. Ellicard, Avalon, and Timber made their way up the curling stairwell silently. Each step was measured so as not to burden the old wood with too much pressure. The last thing they needed was for the floor to creak, alerting their prey of their presence. Avalon reached the top floor and glided to the door. With her silencer at the ready, she pulled the door open, but stopped short of rushing inside. In front of her stood 30 soldiers armed to the teeth. A barrage of polearms thrust forth with surprising speed. Avalon was caught off guard as one of the iron spades pierced her shoulder. She leapt backwards, nearly stumbling down the stairs. Ellicard grabbed her by the coat to keep her stable. Timber fired several arrows in rapid succession, trying to cover the retreat of her companions, but the platoon of soldiers barreled through the storm of arrows and forced the trio down the stairs. Ellicard pushed Avalon against the banister on the lower part of the stairs just long enough to examine her wound. I'll be fine. Do you have any blister cloth? Avalon winced as she flexed her sword hand. The pain would be too much of a burden, so she opted to use her left hand instead. I'm pretty sure Essie would kill me if I had blister cloth, Ellicard said jokingly as he ripped off a piece of his red cloak and wrapped it tightly around Avalon's wound.
Will you two stop bantering? I'm dangerously low on arrows here,
Timber yelled. Her arrows flew wildly at any soldier that dared make his way around the bend.
Master, did you really think Legion wouldn't have thought that you and your little red rabbits would come and take our commander this night? The final night before the great King Coda's historic surrender. You disappoint me.
A familiar voice called from on top of the stairs. Ellicard narrowed his eyes and made his way to charge back up the stairwell, but was caught by Avalon.
Don't be foolish, Ellicard. He's toying with us. He wants us to be on his territory. Let's make our way back outside and figure out a way to maneuver him. Don't play into his hand.
She could feel the hatred seething off the young elf.
You're right,
Ellicard said, nodding to Timber to follow him and Avalon as they ran to the city hall's exit. As the trio banged out into the courtyard, it became exceedingly clear that they had just walked into the actual trap that Inlay had set. 40 guards quickly swarmed them while others closed in behind them. Commander Unrik and his lieutenant waltzed up to the defeated squad as they were having their weapons confiscated.
So, this is how Coda thinks she can win this battle,
the lieutenant scoffed as he lifted the chin of a furious Avalon.
By sending his biggest failures to assassinate you, my commander.
Avalon clenched her teeth and palmed a dagger beneath her sleeve. In a flash, she took the officer by his head and sliced his throat open. The lieutenant gurgled blood as he lurched awkwardly toward Unrik, before collapsing in a bubbling and bleeding mess at his boots.
You will be the first to die, girl,
Unrik shouted. He snapped his fingers to have a soldier move forward, but a shadowy figure stepped between him and Avalon.
Commander, my clan will pay your Divra handsomely to keep these 3 as our prisoners,
Legion said as he eyed Ellicard. Ellicard glowered at the sight of his former master. Unric gazed at the three would-be assassins and thought for a long moment. Very well. Take them to the prison tower. Kalsoon watched from above, hidden in shadows of the rooftop as his companions were ushered forward, unable to help them. Chapter 68. The cell where Ellicard, Avalon, and Timber were being kept was silent, save for the pattering of the soft rain outside the cell window. Moisture drizzled down the rusty bars of the cell window. Lying on a damp pile of hay, Timber counted the many stones that tiled the ceiling. For each crack, she snapped her fingers. For each web she counted, she clapped her clawed hands. Avalon flinched in annoyance at Timber's monotonous game. Will you stop that? I'm trying to think of a way out of here. Timber held still, then sat up. It's nearly dawn. Estina will soon be marching to trample over Coda's army. They'll take the king prisoner, they'll capture the northern beach camp, and then they'll send a large army to take over Long Whisper and burn Lost Dawns to the ground. Her voice was thick with defeat. Ellicard stirred in his silent stupor, but said nothing. Avalon shot an angry glare at Timber. We haven't failed our mission yet. We need to keep our senses sharp. A blade is only as sharp as the rabbit wielding it. Legion appeared from the shadows of the cell, walking closer to the prison bars. His face had a grim look to it. He peered into the prison cell and examined Ellicard and sighed greatly. Ellicard, he began, but hesitated. He struggled with his words as if they were caught in his throat. I wished you died when I threw you over that waterfall. The fate planned for you now will be far worse than death. Ellicard slid his eyes to glance at his former master. Avalon stood from the stool she was sitting on and approached the bars. I have traveled the world and killed many more after I left the clan, but even I eventually found peace. Peace in Judeo. She is a merciful goddess, even to rabbits like us. You can find peace in her as well. Serve a new clan. Serve as a silent one, old friend. Legion lowered his head and shakily rubbed his hands together. No, I think mercy is out of my reach, Avalon. Ellicard swiftly moved to the bars, gripping the black iron tightly in his hands. You taught me nothing but lies. Twisted lies. Your philosophy, your way of life, it's worthless. Legion stepped closer to his former student. My lessons kept you alive in a world that would have otherwise swallowed a whelp like you whole. I survived, but Jeddah didn't. Ellicard hissed in a raspy voice. Legion lashed out and snatched Ellicard by the throat, squeezing tightly. You want to know who killed Jeddah, Ellicard? Ellicard gasped out. Tell me. You did. Ellicard screamed in anguish and struggled to grasp at Legion through the bars. Legion pulled him into the bars and brought his face closer to Ellicard's ear. This will be the closest you ever come to the truth. Now bury your hatred and move on with your life. Ellicard quivered, clenching his teeth in frustration. Why won't you tell me? You were my father when I had none. I loved you, and now you torture me by withholding from me what I need to know. Legion struggled to hold his cold demeanor and loosened his grip on Ellicard's throat. I hold back the truth, because I know it would ruin you as it has ruined me. Ellicard peered into Legion's sorrowful crimson eyes. Legion took a hold of Ellicard's shoulder and raked his fingers downward, dragging the shaking hand down Ellicard's armor. He bowed his head and fell to his knees. The weight of the guilt was too much to bear. Ellicard, it was the only way to save you. Ellicard stumbled backwards and slid down the prison wall. He stuttered as he began to bawl. Master, how could you? Legion grabbed the bars and rattled them. He knelt silently before glancing over his shoulder. You know the truth. Now do what you must. He picked himself up and exited the prison. Avalon knelt beside Ellicard to comfort him. You must forgive him now, Ellicard. He has confessed his sins. For both of you to heal, you must drop your vendetta. Ellicard turned to face her. He deserves no forgiveness, and I no peace. Ellicard squeezed his fist tightly, his leather glove cracking.
The only one who deserves peace is Jetta, and she will have none until every rabbit pays for it in blood.
Avalon furrowed her brow.
I will pray for you.
The clanking sound of keys brought the attention of 3 prisoners to the cell door, where they found Calsoon hastily opening it.
Calsoon!
Timber exclaimed in surprise. Come, quickly! We haven't much time. I found your weapons. We must complete our mission before it's too late.
Ellicard nodded. We've wasted too much time already. The fate of Coda's army rests on our shoulders.
Chapter 69.
I suppose this is as fine a morning to die as any,
Coda whispered, half to himself and half to the leaders by his side. The king had gathered his men at the edge of the forest. The front lines were made up of whatever men could stand. Any who were not bound to crutches and arm slings stood as the final bulwark of their king. These men, as battered and bruised as they were Coda's last hope. Barely strong enough to hold their sword and only strong enough to take a command. Coda stared in fear at the Estinian forces. To surrender now would save many lives, but in the end, Varus would fall, and without their king, Long Whisper would follow soon after. With that, centuries of tyranny would befall Cyprus. He had failed King Dallin, his lords, his people, and most of all, he had failed his father. It's over, Coda finally choked. From across the field, Commander Unrik called out, Do you surrender, King Coda? Coda reached for his words. At first he spoke nothing, unable to grasp the reality of his situation. Then he felt a hand grab him by the shoulders. Coda followed the hand to find it belonged to Edema. Until now, Coda had never got a good look at Edema. She was an elf of some sort. Her hood hung low over her face, and she wore a gold mask that covered the lower portion of her face. The shadow of her hood covered her eyes. She wore silver leather gloves that neatly accented her long white coat. A dark orange trim finished the coat's detail. She wore light silver armor beneath her coat, and her beautifully crafted sword hung sheathed on her left side. She was indeed a mystery, rarely ever speaking. She preferred to let her actions speak on her behalf. My king, this is why we were sent to aid you. Allow us to handle this. Handle? As if it were so simple. Wicker turned to her, looking as confused as the king. Edema slowly walked beyond the front lines and pressed forward down the field. She stopped halfway between the 2 armies. Without turning to look, she commanded her 30 silent ones to fall in behind her. Silent ones, to me. Immediately, flashes of white darted in a row behind her. Edema began to walk again, but at a brisker pace this time. She gripped her blade and drew it from its sheath, creating a piercing sound. Unrik clenched his teeth and winced at the noise. Where all hope fades, we will continue to fight. For we are her courage, her strength, and her light. So draw your blades, touch with Jadeo's might, Edema chanted as she galloped into a sprint, her silencer raised in the air. Upon uttering the 3rd verse, the 30 silent ones pulled out their blades in unison. The ringing was so sharp and loud that the front lines of the Stinian army dropped their weapons to cover their ears in agony. Unrik realized that this mysterious person was a true threat, and despite the overwhelming odds against the silent ones, he was afraid. Attack them! Do not let them reach the lines! Ordered Unrik as he scrambled further into the back lines of his army. And together we shall silence the night, Edema called out as she crashed into the front lines, viciously hacking into soldiers too caught by surprise by the sudden advance to react properly. The 30 silent ones clashed into the fray, joining their leader. Together, the silent ones' forces pushed back the Estinians as they toppled over each other to get away from the deadly silencers. From behind his army, Unrik could be heard shouting orders to destroy the silent ones. But the zeal of the silent ones was not to be underestimated. Each one had been tested by the trials of the blade range and were willing to die for the glory of their goddess. The Estinians were ill-equipped to deal with such a foe, and that disadvantage gave Coda's forces the advantage. Coda looked on in awe at this spectacular feat as less than 40 men pushed back a force of 1,000. His men took notice too. They cheered with a new spurt of hope in their hearts, waving their hands and weapons in glee. I think it is time, my king, said Wicker stoically.
Coda trotted his wolf onto the field ahead of his men and raised the Long Whisper banner. Charge! Coda's men ran across the field, crying blood and thunder in their battle cries, most limping, some refreshed in a dead-on sprint, all with vinegar pulsing through their veins as they broke into the now terrified Estinian lines. The enemy forces clambered backwards, falling over the corpses of their fallen comrades as they broke into a fearful retreat. However, they were halted in their tracks by the sight of Unrik, who had a dagger to his throat. The Estinians dropped their weapons and cowered on their knees, unsure of what to do. Coda broke through to where Unrik was crying out for a formal surrender. There he found Ellicard holding a thin knife under the chin of the Estinian commander. Timber, Avalon, and Calsoon had several other officers tied and gagged. Well done, Sergeant. I'll take it from here. Coda nodded to Ellicard to let go of his prisoner. He then peered into the furious eyes of Unrik. I admit, you had me beat. But it wasn't me you needed to defeat. It was the spirit of Long Whisper that defeated you. You were a worthy adversary, King Coda. It will be a delight to watch you squirm when my Devra burns your lost dons to the ground. Coda's smile faded quickly. Take him away, he said solemnly. You let them escape. You let them win. Inlay snarled at Legion. The two black rabbits stood on a ledge in the mountains overlooking the now liberated city of Stonewall. Legion turned to look at the young shadow elf. His steel clown mask cast a dark shadow in the sunset. This is not how we want to beat Ellicard. Imprisoned by Arik and handed to our clan as some kind of bargaining chip to be at the mercy of the Silent Master. Legion thrust an index finger into Inlay's chest, pushing him off balance a bit. That's not how you imagined his death, is it? Legion read Inlay like a book, and even as clever as Inlay was, he knew Legion was right. He continued to let Legion talk. You want Ellicard all to yourself. You need him to see that you aren't just his student, but his equal. Ellicard, sitting in some scum-filled cage, isn't the proper ending for him. Legion walked past him back to the road. It's not how I imagined his death either. Inlay took one final look at Stonewall before chasing after his high blade. Ellicard had to die by his hands, and his alone. No one deserved Ellicard more. No one. Chapter 70. Night had settled on the newly liberated city of Stonewall. A calmness hung in the air as the exhausted soldiers found their way to the warmth of soft beds and cozy inns, a sharp contrast from the weeks before. The townsfolk were more than willing to share a home-cooked meal and open a fine wine for Coda's weary men. Wicker, Ashmer, Athar, Cass, and Coda sat at a dining table in the home of the mayor. Dinner plates were cleared away as a much-needed meal was eaten by the 5 guests. Small glasses were refilled with the mayor's finest brandy, once hidden from the Estinian men. We will stay in Stonewall one more day. Then we march hard to meet up with our divided forces and the Varisian army on the other side of the mountains, Ashmer stated between a glass of the smooth alcohol. I think we should keep our most injured and ill here in Stonewall. They will be no good to us if they can't march, suggested Cass. Coda curled his hands together, resting his chin on top of his knuckles. How many men do we have if the injured and ill stay here? Ashmer calculated on his hands and did a quick bit of math in his head before finally answering. About 700, plus the 32 silent ones, and 6 vernal mages. We picked up about 30 working catapults and ballistas, too. Well, we've seen the silent ones work. They each fight like 20 men, Wicker mused as he remembered the incredible feat from earlier in the day. Then it's settled. We'll stay one more day in Stonewall, and then take our most well-off men and march through the mountain pass, Coda said, perking up after taking a swig of the welcoming drink. The Crooked Sword was filled to the brim with soldiers desperately seeking a cold drink and a warm hearth after the hellish experience in what they named the Forest of the Splintered Skies. The Arrow members, save for Ellicard, Wicker, and Lear, relaxed to the best of their abilities as they sipped their ales and slurped down the hot beef stew. But no one spoke between them, for their once sharp wit and keen senses were now dull like a rusted blade. Blavar broke the silence. Well, we should bring Lear some ale when we get a chance. Disiakati would appreciate a cold one. Rulen grinned as he joked. Smiles broke from the tired watchers as they agreed that they should pay Lear a visit. Well, look who it is. A familiar and unwelcome voice broke through the good spirits like a war hammer. Blavar turned to find Rith and a large gathering of the 12th Spearman Division chuckling crudely with their arms crossed over their chests. Me and the boys were about to head out and find some fun in this town, but there seems to be some fun to be had right here, Rith said, cracking a snide smile. He nudged one of his fellow spearmen. Not now, Rith. I don't have the patience to deal with your bullshit. Blavar spat before turning back around to Histine. Rith's face curled as he grabbed Blavar by the collar and spun him around in his seat to face him. I see you don't have your captain here. Me and my boys are going to get some hard-earned respect from you arrow bastards, even if we have to beat it out of each one of you. Immediately, seats could be heard screeching back across the floor as each one of the arrow members came to the aid of their companion. Now is not the time to mess with us, spearmen, Timber snarled. Rith moved to Timber, but Rulan stepped into Rith's face until the elf was close enough to see his reflection in Rith's eyes. Stand down, Rith. We've both been through some shit, and none of us want to be tested. Rulan spoke calmly, though his eyes were stressed and sunken from the lack of sleep. Get out of my face, rabbit, Rith sneered. Rulan narrowed his eyes and butted his forehead into the bridge of Rith's nose. A hard thump followed a sharp crack as Rith's nose bent unnaturally. A thick, long droplet of blood dripped to the wooden floor. Rith was taken by surprise as he stumbled backward into the arms of his fellow soldiers. Swords were quickly drawn all around the arrow soldiers, and Rulan and the others prepared for a melee to ensue. However, a loud order rocked the tavern. Stand down, spearmen! Pushing his way between the two units came a scarred and gray-haired elf. A heavy woolen bandage covered his left eye, and the rank of staff sergeant was stitched on his shoulder. Above it was the 12th Spearman Division's unit patch. Sergeant Eloth, we were just... Rith Weasley tried to explain himself. You take me for a fool, Rith. No, Sergeant. You think I didn't see you harass these soldiers? No, Sergeant. Are they the Estinians? Rith held silent, knowing full well what kind of trouble he was in. Eloth's face turned beet red, and a vein protruded under his skin. Then tell me, why you are harassing this unit? Rith clenched his teeth, trying to think of a suitable enough answer that did not land him in an endless session of push-ups. They are rabbits, Sergeant. Rabbits, spat Eloth. Another soldier piped up. They're trained to work by Ellicard, Sergeant. They shouldn't be treated with the same respect as any of the other soldiers. Eloth nodded, and then turned to Blavar. You, Private, did you just spend 3 weeks in the Forest of Splintered Skies? Yes, Sergeant, Blavar said, his face still sour. Eloth pointed to Elisa. What about you? Yes, Sergeant. Eloth pointed to Timber. And you? Were you there too? Timber grinned. Indeed I was, Sergeant. Eloth turned to his unit. Arrow shared the same experience as all of you in that godforsaken forest. They slept in the same shitholes. They bled the same blood. They shed the same tears. They are all as much a part of this army and country as the rest of you. Trained by rabbits? Yes. But they were trained by them to fight and save you pieces of shit from the rabbits. Don't you forget that. The spearmen all lowered their heads. I want all of you outside after you apologize to each one of these arrow soldiers. We're going for a discipline jog until you learn how to give proper respect to your peers. The watchers looked at each other in bewilderment, but each grew a new smile on their faces as it seemed that they finally gained the respect that they yearned for. Ellicard sat in the large temple of Father. The moonlight danced in fragmented colors as it passed through stained glass windows depicting battles against evil that came from the skies. His head was bowed, and his eyes were closed shut as he muttered words of prayer and confusion to the goddess he was once faithful to. Alana, can you hear me? I know you must be disappointed in me. I know I served you without question at one point. Or at least I thought I was serving you. I was really serving a twisted version of you. He opened his eyes, now red with tears from remembering such a tumultuous period of his life. He had no one to turn to for guidance, no God to lean on for understanding. Everything in his life was a lie, and now he did not know whether he wished to live in that lie or be free from it. Alana, I seek your blessing. I am on a path of war, and many will die. At one point, I believe I did your work, and that I was your hand. Now I seek to kill for myself, and I need to know if you will not shame me when I run my blade across the necks that deserve my wrath. Ellicard held silent. He used this moment to reflect on his own thoughts and words. Not for myself, but for her. I wish to kill for Jeddah. I know that she has Alu, but Alana, she lived a life full of trauma and strife. She needs protection. Please, while I slay those that harmed her, watch over her soul. Maybe someday Jeddah and I can meet once more, and I can finally have my peace. Peace can be sought without the shadow of hate in tow, Ellicard. Ellicard's eyes widened at the sound of what he thought was the voice of the one he desperately missed. Jeddah? He turned, looking for his lost friend, but found Avalon sitting in a pew behind him instead. Is she who drives you? Avalon asked thoughtfully. She had seen many tormented hearts since she had begun her service as a Silent One. It was her duty to protect and spread the word of Judeo. Naturally, putting the restless at ease was also a large part of her duties. No, Ellicard spoke simply. Avalon leaned forward and spoke quietly into Ellicard's ear. I was once like you, a rabbit betrayed by her own life. I traveled the lands seeking redemption. I was a slave to an endless nightmare of hatred and sorrow. But then Judeo found me. She gave me my silencer and a new purpose. I still fight. I still kill. I am still an assassin, but now for a greater purpose. I fight for the light and the truth, she said, gripping her sword's handle tightly. Ellicard stood up and began to walk out of the temple. Avalon grabbed Ellicard's hand as he passed her. Ellicard, don't let the darkness swallow you. If you let that happen, you will never find peace. Ellicard snapped his hand away from her. You want to know what drives me? The darkness drives me. I want it to swallow me so that I can be strong enough to face my demons. Avalon lowered her head in prayer as Ellicard stormed out of the temple. Judeo, give Ellicard the strength to walk away from the path he walks. Give him the strength to find his way to the light and find his peace.